Jewish Historical Society on Wednesday, June 23rd, 2010, at the Ability Israel Synagogue, where Alan Rackow will speak about the Jews of Manitoba and their connection to Ottawa.
They give you 18 months to get these out of your system. And we only started to pull in the monies for the 202-203 campaign the last year and this year.
Sylvia, the amount is based on the money that you received.
No, you give receipts out.
It's the receipted money.
Thank you, John. Good evening. My name is Stuart Lazier, and I'm a board member of the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society. We are very privileged tonight to have my uncle Alan Rackow speak to us. As you might know, Alan and his wife Phyllis are royalty in the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society. They attend every lecture and event faithfully, and Phyllis, Alan's wife, is on the board of the society. It is not customary to applaud a speaker before they come up to speak, but but I wanted to mention that Alan married Phyllis on June 22nd, that's yesterday, in 1954. So yesterday was their 56th wedding anniversary. And it's interesting and historically significant that they were married at Agadah Israel Synagogue in a previous location on Rosemont Avenue. So Mazel Tov to Alan, Phyllis, Valerie, Frank, and Barbara who's here tonight. Alan tonight will speak about his research, which follows the Manitoba Jewish community back to the 19th century, and then he will discuss the connection of the Manitoba Jewish community to Ottawa. Alan was born and raised in Winnipeg and studied at Montreal's McGill University, earning his master's degree in engineering. A position at the National Research Council brought him to Ottawa in 1951, where he spent a 36-year career in the Federal Civil Service. After retiring from government service, Alan spent several years as a principal in a consulting firm, and he retired in 1995. Alan's interests include genealogy, listening to music, learning about visual art. He and his wife Phyllis are volunteers at the National Gallery of Canada and very loyal participants in the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society. Now, an earthquake is very hard to follow, but Alan will certainly give it a good try tonight.
I must say, though, that one person who wanted to be here, but the earthquake ruined it, and that was a little wall. They told me we had to go to work because of the earthquake.
Now, I have no idea how effective this microphone is. I don't know if anybody can hear me or not. So please let me know if you want me to shout. I'll shout. So far, my daughter says she wants me to speak up. Okay, so the title of the talk is Jews in Manitoba and Connections to Ottawa. But my emphasis, as you will soon hear, is on my family as well as those who moved east to Ottawa. Books have been written on the whole field of the Jews in Western Canada, and I will refer to three of them later. They're on the table behind you, at least they were when I started out. For this occasion, we shall focus on my own interests. First, a bit of history. Not many people give you history lessons these days, but I will. I'm sure you all remember from your school days that part of North America was granted by King Charles II to his cousin, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, and his friends, who incorporated the Hudson's Bay Company on May 2nd, 1670, a date which is emblazoned in the mind of anybody who lived in Winnipeg and passed the Bay store. The company was formed to exploit the vast fur trade of the territories. The first known Jew on the prairies appeared in the fur trade era. An English Jew employed by the Hudson's Bay Company, which owned the Northwest Territories, originally known as Rupert's Land. Ferdinand Jacobs worked in the Northwest Territories, as the prairie provinces then were, from 1732 to 1775, 43 years, after which he retired to England, leaving no known descendants. That was Ferdinand. Subsequently, a small number of Jews were in the fur trade in the area, having come from Montreal and financed by fellow Jews in New York and London. The story of what is now Manitoba changed with the establishment by a Scottish peer, Lord Selkirk, of the Selkirk settlement, which was begun in 1812. By investing in the Hudson's Bay Company, he was able to buy about 116,000 square miles of the territories, intending to settle impoverished Scottish Highlanders who had been turned out of their farms. This land, called Assiniboia, included parts of today's Manitoba and Saskatchewan, as well as bits of North Dakota and Minnesota, and was the basis for all the early agricultural settlement in the West. It was centered around the junction of the Red and the Assiniboine rivers, now known popularly as the Forks, which is where Winnipeg began. The first Métis uprising under Louis Riel in 1869-1870 brought Ontario militia to the territory to quell the rebellion, and many of these folk decided to stay and practice farming in the better soil of the prairies. This happened to coincide with deep-seated changes in Eastern European society. The industrial and agricultural revolutions spread eastward to the Western Europe, and this had a profound impact on the lives of Jews living in the Pale of Settlement of the Russian Empire. Manufacturing did away with the need for independent Jewish artisans, and young Jews were forced by economic pressure to look elsewhere. As a result, the earliest Jewish immigrants came to the West in the 1870s. Later tragedies, the pogroms in Russia and Romania, hastened the mass movements of Jews into Manitoba, which is when my family's known story begins. This story will be about my maternal forefathers and mothers, inasmuch as my father's clan arrived in Winnipeg in 1913, just before the First World War, from England, where an economic recession drove many people to the colonies. My father was the sixth of 7 children and was the youngest son. The 3 oldest children moved on to sunny California after the Great War, although my grandparents, Rackow, lived in Winnipeg until their deaths. Through my grandmother, Rackow, I have a connection to a major artist. Her maiden name was Antokolsky, and she had an uncle, Mark Antokolsky, who became a famous sculptor in Russia. In St. Petersburg, there is a museum, the Russian Museum, which contains works of art only by Russian artists. In that museum, 2 rooms are devoted to the work of Antokolsky, and other pieces, larger than life-size, are in adjoining halls. It was said that Antokolsky was so famous that the Tsar wanted him to be buried as a national hero in St. Petersburg, but the family objected. I have seen at least one reference which says that, in fact, he was buried in St. Petersburg, but I have no way to know it. My parents had met in Winnipeg sometime during the Great War of 1914-18, and afterwards my father went to California to seek his fortune there. They were in love, and he persuaded my mother to come to Los Angeles, where they were married on July 16, 1924. However, my mother became very homesick, so the young couple returned to Winnipeg sometime before my birth in 1928. My mother's family, the Weedmans, for that is a family name, came from a village called either Orly or Orla, depending on whom you believe, near the city of Bialystok in the Russian Empire. Family lore has it that an ancestor, Pesach Yoina Weidman, was an innkeeper there and sheltered some of Napoleon's troops on the retreat from Moscow. 1881 saw the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, the signal for the first of too many anti-Jewish pogroms under his successor, Alexander III. Many Jews saw the writing on the wall, even 50 years ahead of Hitler, and decided to flee. Among these were my great-grandfather, Beryl Weidman, his wife, Rachel, and their 3 sons. The eldest, Chaim Leib, known always as H.L., was already married and had an infant daughter. Then came Mordecai, my grandfather, and the youngest, Simon. They left Europe. That's why I always say I won the lottery big time. Although a few Jews, principally from the United States and a German Jewish background, had settled in the Winnipeg area and surrounding villages as early as the 1870s, the first significant number of Jews appearing on the scene at one time, including my family, showed up on May the 26th, 1882. They comprised in all a group of 23, which I assume included the baby. So nearly 1/3 of that first group was a Weidman family. That baby was to me Aunt Sarah, even though she was my mother's eldest cousin. My grandfather Mordecai was then almost 18. According to my late Aunt Anne Halter, the group landed from the ship the Brooklyn in Montreal, made their way to Duluth, Minnesota, and thence to Winnipeg by rail. Canadian Pacific Railway was apparently not completed from the east at that time. They were greeted by members of the tiny Jewish community led by Mr. George Frankfurter. Times were tough, and for a vivid description of what they went through, I invite you to read Rabbi Arthur Shields' book, The Jews in Manitoba, available at the Greenberg Families Library at the Solway Jewish Community Center. I knew the rabbi, inasmuch as he had come to Winnipeg to establish the Hillel Foundation at the University of Manitoba while I studied there. And I recall his many interviews with my grandfather while he was researching his book. I owe many of the non-personal facts in this talk to that book. After many harrowing experiences, including for my grandfather, I guess and his brothers, working on a Jewish track-laying gang which had its own mashgiach and observed Shabbat, pushing the CPR across the prairies, and then after 2 years in and around Winnipeg, unsuccessfully tried to farm at the colony known popularly as New Jerusalem near the present town of Moosomin, Saskatchewan, in the spring of 1884. Now, the most famous and largest volcanic eruption of modern times, the Indonesian volcano Krakatoa, had taken place the previous year, and world climate temperatures were lowered for several years after that, ruining global agriculture. They returned to Winnipeg after a series of crop failures, whose cause was certainly unknown to them, and became, as most Jews did, peddlers, then storekeepers and merchants of various kinds, and established themselves in the community. While in Moosomin, my grandparents married in 1885. But the eldest child, my Aunt Anne, who became Mrs. Lionel Halter, was not born until 1887, after they had returned to Winnipeg. She was 10 years older than my mother. The Weidman brothers eventually established a prosperous wholesale grocery business, Weidman Brothers Limited, which also had a division packing herring. Even today, one of my second cousins operates the herring packing business, Weidman Foods. Cousin Donald Weidman distributes Manischewitz products throughout Western Canada, as well as the herring products. Apart from the herring division, the business was sold many years ago to the J.M. Schneider Company. Weidman's herring is justly famous in the West and can even be found in the East. I interpose here to note that other, later, Jewish agricultural settlements in the West did survive. The weather was probably better after the crop failed. The second settlement was founded in 1888 at Wapella, now in Saskatchewan, about 50 miles from New Jerusalem, under the leadership of John Hepner, whose granddaughter, Roberta Pollock, is known to many of you. That colony was financed by British Jewish philanthropist Herman Landau. In 1892, the Hirsch colony, funded by the French Jewish philanthropist Baron de Hirsch and founded by Asher Pierce of Montreal, was successful. The Lipton colony in 1901 was started originally by a group of Romanian Jews, later joined by Russian Jews. One of the descendants of the Lipton colony via the village of Limerick, Saskatchewan, is Florence Rosenfeld, named Margulies, who, like many of the prairie colonists, went to Winnipeg to pursue higher education and graduated in law from the University of Manitoba. She had a distinguished career in the Federal Department of Justice before retirement. Great-uncle H.L. and great-aunts Fanny Dane, anyway, her name had 9 children, and my grandparents, Mordecai and Bessie Schrag, had 7 children. My grandmother Bessie, who was about the same age as Mordecai, came over with her large Schrag family, possibly in the same boat, and arrived in Winnipeg at the same time, although I have not been able to find out for sure. According to my aunt Ann Halter, the Schrag family came from a place in the Austro-Hungarian Empire called Brabi, rather than from the Russian Empire. I have looked that place up on Jewish genealogy, and the closest they come is a place called Borova in modern Poland, about 130 miles south of Warsaw. My grandparents married in 1885, as I said, presumably in Winnipeg, although we have never seen their kedubah, while Mordecai was still struggling to succeed in New Jerusalem. A favorite family story is that when the newlyweds arrived at the Mooseman station, a man with a horse and buggy demanded $5 to drive them to the farm. Mordecai felt this was outrageous, and leaving his bride at the station, walked to his property some miles away, hitched his horse to his wagon, and proceeded to fetch Bessie home. Bessie was one of 8 children, most of whom had several children of their own. At a Schrag family reunion in San Francisco in 2003, I was staggered by the size of the family tree prepared by a couple of cousins who are real genealogists, unlike me. Unfortunately, Bessie died very young, in 1915, before any of her grandchildren, 10 in all, had been born. Thus, the 3 eldest cousins, girls all, were named after her. Bessie, or Kesha, became in succession Betty, Patricia, and Peggy. Of her 7 children, 2, John and Etta Scleeter, had no children. I have been asked whether that marriage was a happy one. I know that my mother adored her mother and frequently told me stories about their happy childhood. Anecdotally, it was an unusually happy family because, according to my mother, Bessie never knew in advance how many people would be coming down for breakfast. Often her 2 older brothers, rather than take their dates home at the end of the evening, would bring them back to the Weedman home, and the girls would bunk in with the Weedman sisters. I don't think this was true of many families in those days around World War I. The Schrags who stayed in Winnipeg were in the junk business, eventually the secondary metals business, and remained so as long as I know. At an earlier stage, in the first decade of the 20th century, the Weedmans were also in the junk business, and they and the Schrag family dominated junk from the Lakehead to the Rockies. There was an interesting lawsuit about 1910 when the Schrags sued the Weedmans because they felt that the profits had not been fairly divided. This case went to the Supreme Court of Canada in 1912. I guess there was no such thing as antitrust law in those days. However, by the time I was around, the families were friendly, and I did spend time with our Schrag cousins. Simon, the youngest Weedman brother, was barely married when he died with no issue. I was told that great-grandmother Rachel, heartbroken, insisted on moving to Palestine so that she could die in Eretz Israel. So the old folks moved there in the first year of the 20th century. They lived in Jerusalem in a large house which H.L. and Mordecai donated to Mother's Shelter Etzer Yaldat when they visited Palestine in 1923. The gift is discussed in the diary that the brothers have printed on their return. It's also in the table. The building is in the Gula district, once called the A district, next to Mea Shearim. And Phyllis and I visited it on our first trip to Israel in 1984 when we saw the photographs of both benefactors on the wall of the lobby. Rachel had died in 1905, Errol in 1916. They are buried on the Mount of Olives, and their graves were found even after the Jordanian desecration. A few months ago, our daughter and her husband and daughter visited Israel and easily found the graves thanks to an Orthodox fluent Jewish guide. The graves, interestingly, do not have the family name Weidman on this tombstone. Merely that Dov Bear, not Errol, and Rachel were from Winnipeg. He is described as the son of Pesafiona, so I assume that he was the son of the Napoleonic era innkeeper. He lived to well over 100. He could have been. And my uncle John Weidman was given the same name, Pesafiona. My great-grandmother is described as the daughter of Nachman a Levite, a name which means nothing to me. We have also recently learned that Beryl had remarried, possibly twice, after Rachel's death. H.L. and Mordecai were active in the Winnipeg Jewish community and contributed greatly to it. H.L. was particularly concerned with Jewish education and was the driving force behind creating the Talmud Torah in Winnipeg. Mordecai essentially founded the Winnipeg YMHA. It is said that during the Great Depression, Weidman Brothers Limited was responsible for 15% of the funds used to keep the Shai Tzedek synagogue operating. Family folklore also says that during that time, Weidman Brothers fed a large number of destitute North End Jews off the back of the truck, as the saying goes. Certainly we know for a fact that H.L. in earlier times used to meet trains in the east, always asking if there were any Jews departing and offering hospitality to them. In the film that accompanied the exhibition, Journey into Our Heritage, which was shown at the National Archives here in April and May of 1979, Monty Hull, or as we used to know him, Monty Halpern, the butcher's son, recounts that story. Former Winnipeg historian Harry Beckman wrote a book on the same name, published in 1980 to accompany the exhibition. My copy is on the table behind you, together with several other items. Some members of the family became well known in their chosen professions in later years. In my view, the most illustrious was Sarah Udo, son-in-law Samuel Friedman, who married my second cousin, Brownie Udo, whose real name was Clarice, but nobody ever called her, and went on to become the first Jew in Canada to be made Chief Justice of a province. During his time on the bench, he was Chancellor of the University of Manitoba for several years. Their son, Martin Friedman, is a judge of the Manitoba Court of Appeal. Interestingly, their daughter, Phyllis Friedman, Martin's sister, went on to marry Dr. William Schrag, also my second cousin, but on the Schrag side. Bill was Chief of Staff of the Niagara Health Region in Hamilton, until he stepped down last year to become Chief Executive Officer of Associated Medical Services. Another second cousin, Lyon Weidman, Donald's brother, named after his recently deceased grandfather, H.L., came to Ottawa to serve in the federal public service, but died far too young. His widow, Carol, may be known to some of you. Winnipeg, as some of you may know, had in the early days of Jewish immigration a North End, it still has one, comparable to Lower Town here in Ottawa, where most Jews settled. Later, as families became more prosperous, many migrated southerly, and when I was a boy, there was a substantial number living to the south of the Assiniboine River in the district known as River Heights. Immediately after World War II, the Winnipeg Jewish community reached its peak, about 20,000 souls. As Alan Levine notes in his 2009 book, Coming of Age, The History of the Jewish People of Manitoba, Winnipeg Jews have latterly moved to the less rigorous climate of the West Coast, and I think the present Winnipeg Jewish population may be about 17,000. I should remark here that Manitoba Jewry is remarkably assiduous in preserving its history. I have mentioned 3 books, 2 of which are in the library at the SJCC, and I have the other one, and there have been several volumes devoted to individual organizations, not of general interest. Mordecai Weidman's own family, as it prospered, did not move south of the Assiniboine, but did move to an area close to downtown Winnipeg, just north of the Assiniboine River, and had few Jews. Before that, they had lived in a house on Lily Street in the old Point Douglas district near the CPR station. That home and others were demolished, as was the street, to make way for the Disraeli Freeway. The large 3-story family home, just to the north of the Assiniboine, was known to the family as 91. Its address was 91 Balmoral Place, a street which was later sacrificed to enlarge the parking lot of the new Great West Life Assurance Company headquarters. It served as the Weidman home until my grandfather died in 1952 at the age of 88, and was the gathering place for the family. After the Weidman children married and moved on, the house was converted to a 3-story triplex. Mordecai and his second wife, Aunt Tessie, as she was to me, lived on the first floor. My Aunt Anne and Uncle Lionel Halter and their daughters Patricia and Ruth lived on the second floor, and originally the top, smaller floor was rented out. My parents and I had lived in an apartment building a few blocks away from 91 until, in the Depression, when I was barely past babyhood, my father lost everything he had, and we were forced to move into the top floor at 91. We were fortunate to be able to do so. This I should remark here that the Weidman families, following the tradition set many years earlier by the Rothschild clan, followed. That is, none of the sons-in-law were invited to join the family firm. No one starved, but there was probably not enough revenue from the business to support all the families. When I grew older, my cousins Pat and Ruth dragged me to school for the first year or so until I was independent enough to make my way alone. In those days, school ended at 4 p.m. We lived in the central park of Winnipeg, just north of the Assiniboine River, and the Taumaturra was in the north end and reachable only by streetcar. Since Taumaturra classes began, I think, at 4:15, it was impossible to get there in time. In those days, it was rare for a family to have one car. 2 was unheard of. Besides, my mother never learned to drive. Hence, I learned some Hebrew and prepared for my bar mitzvah from a Malamed who came to the apartment. I was not the most eager student, nor were my Rackow cousins who also took with me grudgingly. I was one of those unfortunate members of my class whose birthday was in the autumn, and thus I could not get my bar mitzvah over and done with before the summer holidays. I was forced to continue studying until October, when I was at last released. My parents had rented a cottage the summer of that year at the resort of Gimli on the western shore of Lake Winnipeg. How was I to continue my training? Fortunately, my teacher was also a shvacher who came out to Gimli on the train on Wednesdays to slaughter chickens for Shabbat for Jack Wasserman's pious grandmother, who was also summering there with Jack's family. So after doing the chicken thing, he washed his hands and came over to our cottage, and we continued my training. The 2 sides of the Weidman family were very close. Since the children were generally of an age, it was, for my mother's generation, like having a much larger group of siblings. Balmoral Place was 4 blocks away from Furby Street, where H.L. and Fanny lived. I clearly recall that on Saturday afternoons after my grandfather's nap, he and I would have a glass of tea, and then he would walk over to Furby Street after H.L. died in 1933 and read the newspapers to Aunt Fanny. Living in the same house as my grandfather, I was deeply influenced by him. Totally observant himself, he never attempted to force his practices on any member of the family. He was the center of the family. All his life, his sons-in-law called him Governor. Physically, he was of short stature, but his personal ethics, the mighty oak has fallen, said the rabbi at his funeral, insinuated into all of us. Until he died, Whelan Brothers Limited was never open on Saturday. No, Sunday. I should mention that Grandfather Mordecai never spoke a word of Yiddish around the house, even to his second wife, Tessie, who was Canadian-born, which is why I never picked up any of that language. I think he felt that, having shaken the dust of the shtetl from his feet, he was not interested in the old things and embraced his new country's way. In his very last months, when he developed atherosclerosis, he stepped back into Yiddish sometimes. I imagine had my grandmother lived, Yiddish may have been more prevalent. I mentioned that Balmoral Place was not a particularly Jewish area, but oddly enough, in high school, there were 3 Jews in my class, all named Alan or Alan or Alan. The teachers never asked, but surely they must have wondered that this was a particularly Jewish name. Of course, we were all Abraham. After high school, I went to the University of Manitoba and studied electrical engineering. To everybody's surprise, except for my parents, I won the University Gold Medal on graduation. That was 1950, the year of the first of the Great Winnipeg floods. So we never had a convocation. The campus was flooded out. I spent time lugging sandbags to help save our shul, the Shard setting, as well as working at City of Winnipeg Hydro Flood Headquarters. The gold medal brought me a National Research Council bursary to study for my master's degree at McGill. When I was graduated from McGill in 1951, the only job available for a Jewish engineer was with the National Research Council in Ottawa. Thus, I arrived here on September 15th, 1951, and was very impressed with a city that could that day host a meeting of NATO's foreign ministers when I was taken to Parliament Hill to see the great and mighty. Here I met and married Phyllis. Now, how we met is an example of family connections. Some of you will remember the Glatz, Harvey Glatz family. Harvey had an Aunt Lillian, his father's sister, who was married to a former prairie boy, Leonard Halter from Kamsack, Saskatchewan, who had served here in the RCAF during World War II. Len Halter was the first cousin on the other side of my first cousin, Pat Ruth Halter, and often visited Winnipeg. You remember that their mother was my mother's elder sister. Their father, my Uncle Lionel, was Len Halter's father, Fred's brother. Got it straight? In their later years, Fred and Kate Halter lived in Ottawa before retiring to the West Coast. There were a lot of Halters scattered throughout the West. Lil and Len Halter were among the few people I first knew in Ottawa. Anyway, at a mahjong game, Lil Halter asked Lil Freed if she thought her daughter would go out with a new young man in town. Sure, said my future mother-in-law, without consulting me about it. So, regardless, it took, because yesterday we celebrated our 56th anniversary. Another member of the Halter clan became the first commissioner of the Canadian Football League, Joe Sidney Halter said. You can find a photograph of her parents' wedding on page 60 of Ellen Levine's book. It's also in Harry Beckton's book, but it's not a full page. Sid Halter was a towering man, did not suffer fools, gladly or otherwise. He was a lawyer in partnership with Maitland Steinkopf and kept Maitland's name on the door many years after his premature death. Maitland's younger sister Audrey came east to go to school, McGill, I think, and met and married an Ottawa boy, Lawrence Freeman. I mentioned that I had come to work at the National Research Council. My initial task was to undertake investigations for what was then the Royal Canadian Navy. After working at the Council for nearly 3 years, I was invited by the Navy to come to work at Naval Headquarters in the Electrical Engineering Directorate. I stayed there for 8 years, and during that time, I learned something of the use of digital computers for naval tactical application. Thus, after I left the Navy to join the Department of Defense Production, where my engineering knowledge of radar and computers was needed, I found myself doing some unanticipated traveling. In 1962, 2 days after returning from a long vacation in Winnipeg, where we had shown off our 2 eldest children to my family, I was ordered to Paris to represent Canada at a special NATO meeting lasting several weeks. This was the first of a number of increasingly enjoyable business trips to Europe, and the only one when I could not take Phyllis with me. After 3 years as a defense production officer, that is an engineering procurement officer, I won a competition to become responsible for promotion of Canadian industrial capabilities to the United States under what was known as the Canada-United States Defense Production Sharing Program. This function changed slowly as the responsibilities of departments of the Canadian government were modified. This part of defense production became, in 1968, a function of the Department of Industry, Trade and Commerce. I continue to believe that department was remarkably effective in support of Canada, far more so than its successor, External Affairs and International Trade, where I ended my government career and retired. A few other Winnipeggers arrived in Ottawa about the same time I did, some with better prospects than mine. David Golden, who had survived being a Hong Kong prisoner of war and then took a delayed Rhodes Scholarship. I should mention, by the way, one Rhodes Scholarship was awarded annually in the province of Manitoba. Practiced law after the war in partnership with my cousin Samuel Friedman. David was tapped by C.D. Howe in 1951 to become Deputy Minister of the new Department of Defense Production, successor to the Department of Reconstruction and Supply. I joined that department in 1962. 3 weeks later, Dave left government to establish the new Air Industries Association of Canada. He assured me that my moving in was not the cause of his moving out. 5 years later, when government decided to create the Department of Industry, Dave was summoned back to become the first Deputy Minister of Industry. Later, he was picked to inaugurate Telesat Canada as a Crown corporation, first as president and then as chairman. Dave was also, we should not forget, one of the original driving forces behind the National Arts Centre. I understand that Dave and Molly are now living in retirement in Victoria, notwithstanding that they're still listed, or they were not listed, still listed in the Ottawa Jewish Telephone List. Another well-known Jewish Winnipegger who rose to high office in the federal public service was my one-time Sunday school classmate, Alan Gottlieb. After a distinguished academic start as a Rhodes Scholar and then an Oxford Don, he and his wife Sandra, a Winnipeg girl who even today writes occasionally for the National Post, came to Ottawa, where he rose rapidly through the federal public service before becoming Canadian ambassador to the United States during the Mulroney years, as well as having previously been Under Secretary of State for External Affairs, that is, Deputy Minister. Also from Winnipeg was our friend Hai Kailath, whose sudden death last year shocked many of us. A lawyer who joined the Federal Department of Justice and rose to Assistant Deputy Minister in charge of Finance Department Legal Affairs. After retiring from government, he spent his last years until his death with the law firm Zalman's. He once told me that his father had been one of 5 brothers, which explained why I was always running the Kailaths in Winnipeg. Another friend who died not very long ago was Hai Stoller, a fellow engineer who came to Ottawa to work in the public service after graduation from the University of Manitoba, who spent the majority of his career outside of Ottawa before returning here upon his retirement. Let me not overlook Joel Morgan, whom I first met here, but comes from the PEG like so many good people. He spent his career in dealing with regulatory affairs in what I still call national health and welfare. Or Arnold Tenenhouse, whose grandfather and great-uncle founded the short-lived camper settlement in the infertile Interlake region of Manitoba, 100 miles north of Winnipeg, a gift to the unloved government of Manitoba. I haven't tracked his career either, but I have no doubt the two contributed to Canada. I and the others whom I have mentioned were certainly not the first years of from Winnipeg who came to Ottawa to live and work. The earliest of whom I have any personal knowledge is Izzy Feldman, a University of Manitoba trained actuary who came here to work for the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. Everyone in this room surely knows his two daughters who contributed so much to our city, former Mayor Jacqueline Holtzman and Ottawa's premier piano accompanist, Evelyn Greenberg. Another migrant to Ottawa who rose high in the public service was Bert Mijakowski, who retired as Assistant Deputy Minister for Research in the Department of Agriculture. Doubtless there are other migrants in the West, younger than me, whom I have not met, and who have contributed to the Ottawa Jewish community. To these I say, next time, please take advantage of the Historical Society and discuss your background.
I'd like to call upon Sylvia Kurtzman to thank our speaker.
Don't go anywhere, Alan. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had a beautiful talk from Alan, whom I've known, I think, ever since he came to Ottawa, pretty much. And we've enjoyed the tremendous research and the interesting stories you gave of not just your family, but all the people that you came in contact with in the departments and in the civil service. So on behalf of the Society, we'd like to present you with this token and remembrance of this beautiful talk. Thank you.
That concludes the meeting for tonight. There is refreshments at the back of the hall.